much less comfortable. You're probably not going to like some of the things I say, but at least I will wake you up at this time when I at least sometimes take a nap. And what I want to talk about is both, if you want some good news, but also lots of bad news, but also lots of hope for what we can do in the future in terms of transforming the situation I'm going to describe. So let me just begin with saying that a conference like this on how to think about digital futures, innovation, and smart innovation-led growth for both cities, regions, and countries is incredibly exciting to be having that conversation now, because after the financial crisis, there has more or less been a consensus, again, more or less, that we don't just need growth for growth's sake, of which, by the way, we had quite a bit in the 1990s, that led us then to a crisis, but particular types of growth. And this notion of actually transforming ecosystems so we get smart, innovation-led growth in particular directions where we debate the meaning of the digital agenda, etc., is really very important today when we say we do not want personal debt-driven growth, but investment-led growth and innovation-led growth. And this concept of having, the smart growth agenda alongside the sustainable growth agenda, which basically admits that innovation doesn't just have a rate, it has a direction, and the green direction is really a big challenge for the future, is again a very exciting thing to be hearing across the world, from the United Nations to the OECD, of course to the European Commission that has this all over their Horizon 2020 program. And of course, after Piketty's great book, even though I beat him on a book prize. Anyway, after his great book, which has shown us the importance of actually recognizing this massive increase in inequality after the 1970s across Europe, by the way, and also in the US, this notion that we also need inclusive growth, yeah? So smart, sustainable, inclusive growth. How exciting to be then having a conference like this in a time period where these are more or less recognized as being very important. So that's the good news. The good news is this conference is happening at the right time. The bad news is that I personally believe, and I've written quite a bit about this, that we're living in a depressing period where we no longer understand what public policy is about. We don't even have the word, by the way, in economics, and I'll get to this later, of public value or social value. These are concepts we no longer have. We talk about the public good, but that's something specific, which again, I'll get back to. But really, this notion that, policy and innovation policy is just there to kind of set up the right conditions for then business to do really exciting things, or these really lame words like that policy is meant to de-risk or to facilitate, as opposed to recognizing the huge challenges and difficulties that are ahead, which must be shared. And also this notion, at least in economics, when we talk about this, oh God, this is terrible, my babysitter just sent me a message, so telling me that she doesn't, no, I'm kidding, I'm just going to turn off the phone. This notion that policy is just there to fix different problems like market failures, different types of system failures and market failures. This setup of the policy-making process is extremely problematic and will never enable us to actually tackle those big challenges ahead. And this, I don't want to be a bit too pedantic, but you've probably heard this expression, market failures, and the most classic market failure in innovation is, of course, the public good nature of science, right? So, and this is a market failure, and yes, you need the state to step in and fix it, but it's not enough. Let me just explain what I mean by that. Basic science and basic research, which we all know is essential to both IT and to green and to biotech and nanotech, is a public good in the sense that the spillovers are so wide that the private sector doesn't have, if you want, an incentive to invest in it, because they wouldn't be able to appropriate the benefits just to themselves. And so you need government to step in and to fix that problem. That's a public good problem. It's a big problem, and all sorts of market failures do exist, but would it be enough to simply have policymakers point to different problems and come in like a nurse and put a bandage? Yeah? And my answer is no, and that this is a huge problem today, that we think the problem is just to put bandages here and there without recognizing the immense opportunity that we actually have to think about policymaking in a very, very different way which I'll try to develop with you in a minute. But I also want to remind you that you are constantly fed this bullshit about the state not being more important than creating these background conditions in great newspapers and magazines like The Economist, which here, for example, very clearly states the problem, right? What is the state for? We're not the Tea Party, we are adults, we admit the state is important. Invest in skills, in infrastructure, that always seems like the magic solution, infrastructure. Invest in some education, but then get the hell out of the way. Why? Because the revolutionaries in the private sector, that way they can do their great thing in whatever landscape we're talking about. So it couldn't be more clear. And every week, I actually subscribe to this great magazine. You read things like this in the editorial. And so this positioning of, the state, Kafka here, as necessary but boring, and just there to facilitate, to administer, to de-risk, to create these background conditions, and then get out of the way for these really cool guys, Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or Elon Musk or the equivalent in every country, the entrepreneurs, to do their thing, is a myth. This dichotomy is a myth. You need just as much out-of-the-box thinking, be hungry, be foolish kind of thinking in the public sector as you need in the private sector. We can only build dynamic public-private partnerships when we believe just as much in both, and we really focus on creating a dynamic type of partnership, and what I'll argue towards the end of my talk, a symbiotic and not a parasitic predator-prey kind of partnership. So to be honest, the word partnership I think doesn't mean much unless we actually have metrics to distinguish if it's mutualistic or not. And of course, ecosystems, that's the trendy word. If you know anything about biology, we do have parasitic and symbiotic ecosystems, and really thinking through how to create dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic ecosystems in innovation that create not just smart growth, but inclusive growth has to begin with debunking this assumption, this cartoon assumption, which does not create good policies and also fuels inequality. Okay, so I'm going to try to sort of convince you about that. I don't have time to go over these great quotes, but just to say that there have been some really inspirational thinkers who I think really try to push the agenda for the public sector to think big. And one of them is Karl Polanyi, who was a historian, sociologist, and anthropologist, all sorts of things, not an economist, who really actually documented historically that the national capitalist market, which is what we mean by market, not the local market selling fruit and vegetables in the corner, which has been around pre-capitalism for thousands of years, or international market, so international trade has also been around for a long time. But the national capitalist market, which is about 250 years old, was forced into existence through policy. So even just that fact, which he documents beautifully, it's a fantastic book, means we should even be careful with words like intervention. It's not that you have the market there and then policy intervenes. No, markets are outcomes of different types of actors, public and private, even third sector, who interact in different ways, and policy making has been part of that market making, market shaping process, as opposed to just market fixing. Keynes, who I think has not been understood even by the Keynesians, I think had a lot to say more than just the need for government to step in during a recession, to be counter-cyclical, which to be honest would be great if that was happening across Europe. So I should, anyway. But to think big and not just to be tinkering around the edges, to not just make things a little bit better or a little bit worse, but to make big things happen that would not have happened otherwise, is just important in the boom as it is in the bust. It's not just because we have economic growth problems right now that we don't have enough investment in green. There's lots of types of green investments that even if we were in a boom, would still be very uncertain, high risk, capital intensive, and they require public investments just like the same equivalent period in the IT revolution or biotech required that. So just thinking of the role in terms of this business cycle effect is also a problem, and Keynes has wonderful quotes where he shows us he actually thought much more interestingly. Anyway, sorry for the self-promotion here, but when your book is translated into German as Das Kapital, it's kind of interesting to show it. No, but It's a great translation, actually, because it's the capital of the state. So what I've been trying to do in my work is to, again, change the vocabulary, not spending, but investing. Not being just a lender of last resort, which again, just think how boring all these words are, but investor of first resort. And really looking historically also at different countries, regions that have achieved smart innovation-led growth and looked at that kind of both public and private investments and asked questions about how those investments were structured, which then enabled all sorts of revolutionary things to happen, to follow. Let me skip through that. So what I want to do is actually focus on 4 big points, and excuse me if there's lots of them, but these are really important points for, again, changing the conversation. I'm sure you've heard of this need for government not to pick winners. Raise your hand if you've heard that expression. I can barely see you. Okay, good, at least some people. So this notion that government shouldn't pick, right? Shouldn't be strategic, shouldn't make choices, and should simply, level that playing field, as I mentioned before, is a false problem. The first point I want to talk about is how actually we have to admit directionality and look in the past at how certain directions were set, not by choosing a particular technology or a particular sector, but through broad mission-oriented challenges, big problems, but these problems were picked, and then beneath them required all sorts of other types of strategic decision-making, but to just get away from this notion that you're not choosing or strategically tilting the playing field in a particular way. Second is, in order to have this entrepreneurial state agenda, we need to admit that there's going to be a lot of screw-ups, right? For every kind of attempt you do at doing something interesting, you're probably going to also make quite a few errors. So trial and error and error and error. Everyone knows this in the private sector, but as soon as the public sector makes a mistake, it's like, stupid! Go back to just leveling the playing field. Don't try to do anything specific because you will fail. So how do we actually welcome failure, in public institutions, as opposed to just, bash them as soon as they make a mistake? But that wouldn't be enough to welcome failure. That would be, not very good. It's how do you learn from mistakes? How can we turn public organizations into learning organizations which can actually explore the policy space and be creative and experiment? 3, how do we actually assess policies, evaluate them, which are in fact more than just fixing markets, but shaping and creating? If we don't have metrics, then actually we all constantly get told that particular investment vehicles by the public sector or agencies are crowding out the private sector. Or again, picking winners. So we don't have the right tools. We have very static, boring tools. And last, how do we share not only the risks, but also the rewards, so that we can have this inclusive growth agenda be something real. So first, let me be quite quick. The first point is, nothing's a fact, everything has to be interpreted, but this, that all the big technological changes which actually have transformed economies and many different sectors worldwide absolutely could not be explained if we just had policy, fixing different types of market failures. What all these general purpose technologies which affected productivity in many different sectors had in common was that the level of public policy involved was actually quite deep, but especially broad across the whole innovation chain. We often hear, including in countries like Spain, that, we're so good at science, we have good human capital, we have okay universities, but we're just crap at commercialization. And in Europe, you hear this quite a bit. It's called the European paradox. So we have good science, no commercialization. And then the solution ends up being something like, we need more venture capital, or funds of funds, or little, cerotti, that's the Italian word, bandages. I don't know how you say bandages in Spanish, across that chain, when actually what's interesting is that in the US, which is always described to us as somehow more flexible, less state, more market, and in Europe, we're kind of more boring and welcome less risk-taking, etc. Actually, in the US, they had a lot of government investment through the whole chain, not just fixing the public good problem of basic research, lots of spending on applied research, and institutions that would welcome the feedback between them, but also, and this is very interesting for Europe, downstream, different sources of patient finance, so patient, long-term, committed, strategic finance for companies themselves, which were picked. Okay, not every company gets a lot of strategic finance. Recent examples would be the Tesla S car, which got $465 million in a guaranteed loan from the Department of Energy. Solyndra, by the way, got a bit more and failed, but again, coming back to the point before, for every success you will have some failures. But also through particular schemes like the Small Business Innovation Research Program, SBIR there, which through procurement policy, so government purchases, has been providing patient finance to small companies that can prove that they're interested in a particular new innovative pathway. So it's not for any company, but the small innovative companies, small medium innovative companies that get procurement contracts. But anyway, I've also put InQtel here, which is one of the biggest public venture capital funds in the world of the CIA. It should worry you a bit, but as I'll show you in a minute, the CIA has also been quite important for the iPhone. But anyway, this, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, ARPA-E, which is the sister organization of DARPA, but in the Department of Energy, which just came out about 2 months ago with a big new innovation in battery storage. These are all publicly financed. And by the way, ARPA-E was set up in 2009 when Obama did something Europe didn't. What's that? Stimulus. $800 billion of stimulus for the economy after the crisis was not just spent randomly across the whole economy.